let's get started. Thank you everyone for joining our webinar today on exposure management and your attack surface. My name is Nikki. I'm the go-to-market marketing manager at Intruder, and I'm your moderator for today's session. Before we jump in, I'll give you a quick snapshot on what we're going to cover as your agenda. We're going to cover off what is exposure management and how does it differ from attack surface management. We'll talk to you a bit about prioritization and why context really matters. We'll give you some valuable insights on how you can get started, and then we'll walk you through the Intruder platform and show you how we can help you do it. At the end, we'll leave some room for questions, so please, we encourage, do ask away in the chat, and we'll go from there. So, our speakers today, let me introduce them to you. I have Andy Hornegold, our VP of Product, first up.
Hey everyone, my name's Andy. As Nikki says, I'm the VP of Product. I'm also joined by Dane.
Thanks, Andy. Hi everyone, I'm Dane. As you can see, I lead the sales team here at Intruder. So I'll be joining you a bit later on to give a quick demo, and I'll be mapping back the platform to Andy's talk and some of the concepts from that. So back to you, Nikki.
So that's all from me, and I'm going to hand you over to Andy to get us started.
Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon or morning, wherever you are in the world. As you already know, my name's Andy. I'm the VP of Product at Intruder. My background is very much offensive security. So before I joined Intruder, I was a Mandian and I was the EU Red Team lead there. So you'll probably see a little bit of my offensive security elements creeping into the presentation today, but hopefully you find a benefit in that. So let's kick straight off with what is exposure management. A lot of people have probably heard a lot of acronyms recently or at any point during cybersecurity. And I'm going to touch on cyber threat exposure management or continuous threat exposure management and exposure management. I'm going to use both of those terms together. They mean the same thing in this case. If you're doing exposure management, it's going to be a continuous process. And I'm going to also show you how all of the likes of attack surface management and vulnerability management play into that process. So some of you may have read the Gartner paper on exposure management, and one of the key things they draw out is that by 2026, organizations that do exposure management are going to be 3 times less likely to suffer a breach. Now, that's quite a big claim, quite a bold claim, something that potentially we're never going to be able to measure, especially in 2-3 years' time. Are we going to look back and say whether this worked or not? And what I'm hoping is over the course of this talk, you'll start to see actually maybe it's not outside of the realms of reason for us to reach a point where we're 3 times less likely to suffer a breach. So we'll come back to this at the end. Exposure management is currently defined as a set of processes that give you the ability to assess visibility, accessibility, and vulnerability of your digital assets. So visibility, do you know what's there? Do you know what assets you have? Their accessibility, do you know if they're exposed to the internet or not? And vulnerability, what kinds of risks exist on those assets? So I'm going to start off with vulnerabilities versus exposures. So vulnerabilities we're all relatively aware of what a vulnerability is. These days tend to be more in isolation. They pop up in vulnerability management tooling, and we end up playing a little bit of whack-a-mole if we have multiple vulnerabilities emerging continuously, because they're single data points, they exist on a single asset, and that's the kind of data we have within a vulnerability management process to try and reduce risk. But when we start to talk about exposures, we're talking much more about what's the additional context around those vulnerabilities? Where do those assets sit within my organization? And what can an attacker do to get from the outside all the way through my organization to the big, juicy crown jewels at the end that all attackers are looking to try and compromise? So this is what we call an attack path map. Many of you may have seen this before, but we'll come back to this occasionally through the talk. So CTEM, exposure management, follows a relatively straightforward process. So we start off with scoping. Scoping is an important part of the process where we define which objectives our business has and wants to achieve over the next 1, 3, 5 years. We then flow into discovering assets and prioritizing assets that support those business objectives. So which ones support my objective to grow by 50% over the next year, 2 years? Which of those assets contribute the most towards those goals? we then move on to identifying and prioritizing weaknesses that we find within those assets. We use that information to act in a meaningful way to reduce our likelihood to be compromised by an attacker. We then go on to a reporting stage. So the reporting stage is really about engaging with the business and giving cyber risk in terms that they will understand. This is called continuous threat exposure management because you don't do this once, it is continuous. We are always finding assets, we are always finding weaknesses, and we are always acting on that information to make sure that we reduce risk. So vulnerability management really is the very core and the first element within cyber threat or continuous threat exposure management within exposure management. On top of vulnerability management, we have built attack surface management. And attack surface management is important because vulnerability management looks to find vulnerabilities within assets and then give you an approach to fixing and reducing that risk. But then discovering assets is super important as the first part of a vulnerability management process, because can you really protect things that you don't know about? How do I scan things if I don't know they exist? Finally, we move on to exposure management, and exposure management builds on top of that attack surface management process. And the reason exposure management exists is because attack surface management, trying to scan for everything and trying to find and fix every single thing that we have that our company is exposed to, is an incredibly difficult task. And if you're trying to fix everything all of the time, you're running a bit of a fool's errand. So scoping is really important, and understanding which elements we can focus and dedicate our time to have the greatest impact on our business. So that's exposure management. Let's focus on why it's essential. So it's essential at the moment because currently it's difficult to find what's exposed across an attack surface. It's difficult to understand how those exposed assets sit within our wider organization and how they contribute to our business objectives. It's difficult to understand vulnerability context. So is it likely to be exploited? What happens if somebody compromises an asset using a vulnerability? And then understanding the threat landscape. The threat landscape is always changing. New vulnerabilities are always emerging. It's a very difficult place to be. So it's difficult to measure all of those things because vulnerabilities, like I mentioned, are often handled in isolation. Individual systems are detecting different parts of cyber risk, and then we're having to join up those disparate data sets. Remediation and mitigation are frequently reactive as well. And what I mean by that is we often have a security team who are responsible for detecting those risks and those vulnerabilities within our attack surface, and then finding the owner of those assets as soon as a vulnerability has emerged, getting the information to those people, and then tracking through the process of understanding, have they fixed the vulnerability? How effective has that remediation or mitigation been? And as a result, as organizations, we expend resources fixing issues that aren't impactful to our business. We overlook weaknesses which threat actors are currently actively exploiting. And we take longer to fix a vulnerability than it takes an attacker to find that vulnerability. And that gap is where bad things start to happen. So as a result of those 3 bullet points, we increase the residual risk to our business, and we have risk that we don't fully understand on our books. So how can we get started? How can we start to build our journey through exposure management? And I want to put down a little bit of a line in the sand here, which is exposure management. There's no silver bullet to exposure management. It is an emerging process and framework, which is, I don't think any organization is doing 100% effectively at this point in time. But we'll step through each of the phases of exposure management that I mentioned previously and see how you can contribute to that within your organization. So let's start off with the scoping process. The scoping process is really important because we want to focus on the things that matter to our business. So we need to identify business priorities first. So rather than trying to fix everything, rather than trying to find everything, let's try and find the things that are really going to impact our business. This is most likely going to be a manual approach. You're unlikely to be able to automate the idea of finding exactly what your business goals and priorities are. So you're probably going to be doing workshops, having discussions with people internally, and documenting where the business is going in 1, 3, or 5 years' time. You'll then want to understand what contributes to those business priorities, what systems, what kind of threats might exist to us achieving those objectives. One of the key bits of advice I can give you is start with external threats. Internal threats are very difficult to assess, but external threats, they are the most exposed elements within your attack surface. If something's internet facing, that's probably where you want to begin, and you want to make sure that that thing is locked down as effectively as possible. Shouldn't just be considering assets, so I'm talking hosts, IP addresses, systems. Exposure management also focuses on the likes of online code repositories, SaaS products. Don't just focus at the infrastructure layer, also think about your application layer as well. So SaaS can be a really difficult problem to solve. At Intruder, we use a product called Cloudara, which helps us track our SaaS use. And we have business owners associated within the organization to each of those SaaS products, so that if there is any risk associated with those products that we use, we know who to go and communicate with immediately. And that's super important to do over the course of this scoping process. One of the key things you want to do is understand who is responsible for those assets, who can actually act on mitigating or reducing risk on those assets. So during the scoping process, you're collecting that data and you're defining that for your organization. So once you've defined your scope, you know what your business needs to achieve over the next N months, and you want to ensure that you know all of the assets that support those objectives. That's when we start to move on to the asset discovery and prioritization side of things. So we're looking to actively identify those underlying assets that support our business. You may already have technologies that do this. If you're, a startup, scale-up business, you're probably cloud first, and your cloud consoles can help you dump the information for what's exposed to the internet. Configuration management tooling as well. So endpoint management, endpoint configuration is a really useful data source for assets and understanding what is exposed to the internet. We've already touched on vulnerability management as one of the core principles for exposure management. And if you're already doing vulnerability management, again, a very, very good use case and data source for finding those assets. Because I think a little bit like an attacker, there's also other options for you to discover internet exposed assets that maybe you don't know about. So those things start to coalesce around the idea of attack surface management. So I can use search engines to find other assets that belong to my organization that perhaps I am not already covering under vulnerability management. I can use TLS certificates like transparency logging, public source code repositories. I can start to harvest data from them, internet scan databases, and passive DNS databases. I won't go into too much detail on how you can do that because we have a really good blog post that's available already. Please feel free to go read that, and it will drill down into exactly what you need to do to get that information. What you'll probably find is that actually your ASM tooling, if you're using any kind of attack surface management tooling, will use one or more of these techniques to try and find those assets for you. So if you are using attack surface management, you're already on your way to being an exposure management ready organization. So off the back of this, we've found assets that we knew about, or we've got access to assets that we knew about using existing technologies, and we've started to do some digging into what we didn't know about using ASM and the techniques on your screen at the moment. Next step is let's begin to prioritize those assets. Which ones support our business objectives the most? Which ones are most critical to us achieving those business objectives? The way I recommend prioritizing this is on 3 key points: criticality, accessibility, and then control coverage. So criticality is how important is that asset to your business objective? What happens if it's compromised? So if it is compromised, does it result in an attacker being able to delete everything in my environment, or does it just result in them being able to see some technical information which doesn't really have any bearing on my business? Accessibility, how easy is it for an attacker to reach that asset? Is it exposed to the internet? Is it only an internal asset? How many connections does that asset have to other assets within my organization? So what that means is if I compromise one system, can I move from that system to anywhere within your organization, or can I only access a very limited subset of your organization or of your network? This is going to be really important. The accessibility side of things is kind of useful when it comes to the attack path mapping that I'm going to come on to shortly. Finally, control coverage. What security controls protect this asset and how effective are they? The first two start to increase your risk. So if it's critical, my risk increases as that thing is exposed. Accessibility, the more accessible it is, the higher the risk associated with it. But actually, if I start to have more security controls associated with it, and importantly, if they're effective controls, that begins to reduce the risk. So these are the three things that are useful to consider when you're doing asset prioritization. And what I think is important is you don't need to be complicated here. You can start with critical, high, medium, low if you want, and just tagging assets within your your asset databases or your vulnerability management tooling to give this kind of prioritization. At the end of this process, you'll have a list of assets which have a prioritization rating, which allow you to understand which assets support your business objectives. So the next step is weakness discovery and prioritization. Many of you are already doing vulnerability management, so I don't want to spend too much time digging into what is involved with weakness discovery, other than to say making sure it's continuous is probably the most important part here. One-off pen tests are good for doing an update on compliance and getting a deep dive once a year, but bridging that gap between annual pen tests and making sure you're aware as the threat landscape and your attack surface changes is incredibly important. Dane will touch on this a little bit when it comes to the demo later. So once we've found our vulnerabilities, we need to start to prioritize them. And this is an interesting part because many of us may be aware of how vulnerabilities are prioritized. CVSS is one of the common ways that vulnerabilities are scored. But there's 5 real key questions that I'd like you to ask yourself when you see vulnerabilities. What's the impact of successful exploitation of that vulnerability? How easy is it to exploit that vulnerability? Is there any evidence of it being actively exploited? Is it likely to be exploited in the next 30 days? And finally, are there any security controls in place that mitigate the exploitation of that vulnerability? Now, those first 2, impact and ease of exploitation, already exist within that CVSS scoring. So you can take advantage of CVSS there. Evidence of it being actively exploited, we're starting to move more into the threat intelligence side of things, but you can do this relatively cheap. There is the free and openly available CISA known exploited vulnerability list, which is incredibly useful and used quite a lot by organizations to validate whether or not a vulnerability needs to be acted upon immediately or not. The 4th bullet point there, is it going to be exploited in the next 30 days? Well, we're starting to move more into the predictive side of things. Machine learning, all of the fun and games we've heard recently about AI, but this is already a thing that is publicly available. It's called EPSS, and it comes from the FIRST org, and they give you a score between 0 and 1 of how likely a vulnerability is to be exploited over the next 30 days. Finally, security controls which limit exploitation. Your vulnerability scanning and your vulnerability process should help you understand what those security controls look like. As we go through that prioritization process with vulnerabilities, what we're really looking to do is remove any of those weaknesses that are not impactful at all, because we don't want to spend time on stuff that isn't impactful to the business, things that aren't going to be exploited, things that aren't likely to have business impact. So we now have 2 prioritization scores. We have our weakness prioritization score, and I'm sure many people have seen this in their vulnerability management solutions, a bunch of issues that have the same rating, critical, critical, high. Like, which critical should I fix first? Which one is likely to result in me being compromised in under 1 hour by a bad guy? Well, you start to layer on top the asset priority scoring, and that asset priority scoring gives you a view of which ones you should act on when. So as you can see here, I have a critical weakness. One's in my critical priority asset and one's in a medium and a low. First thing I should focus on is the thing that's going to have the biggest impact on my organization. And at the very bottom, you can see there's 2. There's a low risk vulnerability on a low risk asset. Maybe I never remediate that. If I'm focusing on the 25% that's going to have the biggest impact on my business, I should be focusing on those criticals. At this point, we kind of have a scoring system. We have a bunch of different, we have vulnerabilities and weaknesses within our assets. We need to start trying to validate that. And exposure management, one of the key elements of exposure management is I've taken vulnerabilities, assets, I've prioritized them. How effective really is it that or how likely is it that an attacker can really compromise my environment? And this is a difficult thing to solve automatically. I don't think anybody's doing this perfectly across cloud and internal assets. I think it is still very heavily consultancy led, but there are some things you can do. Wiz are effective at this in the cloud. I think we've all seen, attack path maps start to take shape in different organizations. But if you want to go down the route of full attack path mapping, one of the things we need to think about is, what can an attacker do once they get into that environment? So I land on a host. Can the attacker now access credentials from that asset? Can they query other systems on the internal network? Can they move laterally? All of these kinds of questions start to make it more and more difficult that you're likely to automate that process. So again, leaning on consultancy is probably the right approach here. And there's no silver bullet. Like I said earlier, there's nothing that is going to give you exposure management in one box. It's going to take a process and a journey for you to reach this point. So currently, many organizations are using pen testing, and you can give pen testers the guidance and the steer to give you this kind of information. But as you become larger and more mature, you're going to start to deliver red teams or have red teams delivered and purple teams. So those are targeted threat exercises, and purple teams are where they work with your security team to help you improve and map this process. So one of the key things about attack surface management when it comes to exposure management is that attack surface management focuses very heavily on one part of this attack path. And the part it focuses on is that very first step. So attack surface management tries to stop a breach from occurring up front. And it does that by finding the vulnerabilities continuously and telling you about exposures that are likely to be exploited before a breach becomes a breach. Everything after this first hop becomes a breach and essentially starts to bleed into the incident response process. So I've mentioned validation. It's really important to validate all of the assumptions you previously made. Do your security controls in place actually, are they as effective as you think they are? Are those assets truly internet facing or not? Or the ones that you don't think are internet facing, are they actually internet facing? And are those vulnerabilities really exploitable? So off the back of this process, we now have a bunch of weaknesses and vulnerabilities that we know about, and we want to take that information and act effectively. So I've mentioned at the very beginning, the current problem is with vulnerability management is that we have a single security team trying to track down individuals, trying to provide enough information as possible, trying to validate whether the remediation was successful. Exposure management really looks to streamline this process and empower people who are in a position to act to do so quickly. So through the scoping process at the very beginning, you've already identified areas of the business and the associated systems that support those business objectives. And you've also identified business owners within those objectives that you can lean on to do this kind of remediation. So how can you empower them to act? Well, one of the first things you can do is getting them embedded in your attack surface management solutions or your vulnerability management solutions, giving them that visibility, and then really starting to define at what threshold should these people begin to act. So that threshold kind of becomes a bit like a playbook that we have for incident response, which is if I find a critical remotely exploitable vulnerability on an asset that supports one of my key business functions, you need to act within 24 hours. And allowing people to do that, having that common language and agreement allows you to act proactively rather than a security team reactively trying to do all of this at the point a vulnerability emerges. So time to fix is one of the key things that we try to reduce here by giving those end users or the people who have the ability to act access to this information as quickly as possible. We reduce that time to fix. And reducing time to fix is useful as security practitioners, we know, because it reduces that window of opportunity for an attacker to compromise your organization. But when it comes to the wider organization, do they truly understand what we are talking about when we say time to fix? Time to fix, if we say it went down from 30 days to 14 days, ask yourself the question, so what? Like, so what? 14 days, are we still likely to be exploited or compromised if that same vulnerability is exploited within 14 days rather than 30? The answer is probably still yes. Maybe. So we need to start talking in terms of terms the business understands. Now, during our scoping process, we mapped out core objectives and goals that the business wants to achieve. And through this exposure management process, we've mapped assets and vulnerabilities to those goals. So we can now say with much more confidence, if this asset was exploited and that vulnerability that I fixed, that critical vulnerability on a critical asset, if that was exploited, then we would have had a delay, we would have had downtime of up to 6 months based on the current ransomware impact. And as a result, we would have lost X amount of revenue. So really starting to answer those questions, what can be compromised now? How likely is that compromise is going to happen? Is the impact on the business short, medium, long-term objectives meaningful? And then what's the operational downplay in revenue? So I'm hoping over this process, you've come to the realization that I did as well, which is that realistically, this is always prioritization. We have a limited amount of time, a limited amount of resources, and what we're trying to do is focus on the stuff that really, really matters to our business. So we want to remove the distractions. We want to allow those teams to be able to react and focus on what matters. We want to find those things that can have a meaningful impact to our business. And then we want to report that to the business in terms that align with our business objectives. So thank you very much for listening to me. I'm sure you've heard the term asset and business objectives far too many times over the last 25 minutes. So I'm going to hand over to Dane now to let you know how we can help you at Intruder solve some of this exposure management problem. Dane, over to you.
Thank you, Andy. I'm also going to be using the word asset quite a lot. So thanks for teeing me up there, Andy. All right, so look, what I'm going to do now is just kind of demonstrate how we built into Intruder some of the concepts that Andy's just covered. So by the end of the demo, you'll be able to see how Intruder can support outcomes across that exposure management framework that we've just looked at. So the reality is that there are plenty of use cases that I could have chosen from, but we are short on time, so I'm going to have to be very selective here. I'm going to focus on use cases that relate to the asset discovery and the identification of weaknesses stages of that framework. So if we begin with asset discovery, so often at Intruder, we will hear the security teams that are struggling to keep on top of their attack surface for at least, I'd say, a couple of reasons. So firstly, it's often the case that it's not those teams who are responsible for spinning up or spinning down assets, and that's typically happening elsewhere in the business. It could be a function of a DevOps team or an engineering team, or maybe even for example a marketing team. And so that introduces the potential for knowledge or security gaps between those teams. And then the second reason is actually just down to the sheer pace of change in a modern attack surface. Things are not only changing daily, sometimes they're changing by the hour or even by the minute. So when it came to sort of tackling this problem of asset discovery, we really wanted to use automation to kind of bypass a lot of those problems that I've just described. And we do this in various ways. I'm going to start by showing you how we handle the automated discovery of cloud environments. So if I jump into the portal here, and if I click on add target, you can see at the top, we've got some pretty classic kind of, let's say, ways or means of adding targets. These are probably more associated with a traditional vulnerability management program. So things about, you can add them in, that's fine. But if we look at the bottom here, our cloud asset sync feature, this is more of a discovery feature. So if I click into here, you can add cloud accounts across any of these major platforms. And what that does is it allows us to start pulling targets automatically from those accounts into Intruder. But if we look into AWS, we also support AWS organizations. So what that means is that you don't necessarily have to add all of those individual accounts. You can just add the organization, which will automatically detect any accounts associated with that organization. And then that will go on to automatically detect any targets, obviously, within those accounts. So once you do that, it will begin to populate and look like this. This is an example of a cloud account. You can click into that cloud account and you can very rapidly start to see the targets that exist within that account. So as you can see, it's just a nice, quick way of enumerating your cloud attack surface without any sort of operational friction, let's say, between teams or without any kind of human error. Okay, so that obviously was a very sort of quick and high-level demonstration of how we sort of build visibility across cloud environments. But as Andy mentioned, your attack surface doesn't just kind of stop at that infrastructure layer. So if I go back into the targets page now, you can start to see that actually Intruder will look at other areas. So for example, the application layer that Andy mentioned. So that means it will be scanning for things like login pages, the presence of APIs and things like that. So if I just sort of pause on this example here and hover over the information button, you can see this looks to be like some sort of login page that requires an authentication for full scanning. So I can click into that target. I can look at the authentications and I can confirm that, yeah, okay, we've got some kind of, custom login page here that really, you'd want to run some sort of dynamic application security test against. So I can do that. I can add an authentication. I can add, via recorded login, and that allows me just to kind of set up my DAST. So there you can start to see that we're actually transitioning from a kind of a core asset discovery use case through to more of a identification of weakness use case in this case by facilitating DAST. So we're going to come back onto that concept of identifying weaknesses in a moment, but I just want to stick with asset discovery for a while longer. And I want to return to that second challenge that I mentioned that we regularly see, which is really concerning just the general sort of pace of change in a modern attack surface. And I just want to focus on a few ways that Intruder can help to provide that sort of real-time view. So I'm going to go back to the cloud account that we looked at before and click into that. And if I was to click up into the settings options, you can see we've got a couple of features here that really help to provide that sort of real-time view. So the first option we call automatically sync new targets. And what that means is that if somebody in the business spins up, a new sort of asset in that cloud account, we'll automatically detect it. If it has an internet-facing IP address associated with it, we'll find it, we'll bring it into Intruder. And then we can actually go the next step further. So if you look at the next feature, automatically scan new targets down here, what we can then essentially do is if we find something new, we can automatically scan that for vulnerability. So again, a really clear sort of transitional use case. We're discovering assets and then we are finding weaknesses in those assets. So just while we're on this page, I don't really have time to go into some of the other phases of the exposure management framework, but just because we're on the page and I can see the functionality in front of me, here's where we can introduce the concept of tags. So Andy mentioned a few times that, if you're looking at assets and you're ranking them in terms of their business criticality, how critical are they to your business objectives? Here's where you can start to apply tags so that you can have, high criticality assets, and that will help you further on down the line if you find, for example, high criticality vulnerabilities on those assets. But we don't have time to go into too much detail on that, I'm afraid. Okay, so back to these two features here. So these give you a really, really kind of good baseline when something changes. So like I say, something new spun up, you found it, you've scanned it, and you've done all of that before an attacker's had a chance to really try and find the asset themselves. But obviously that's a sort of point in time benchmark. If we come down into our account settings here and look at our scan options, for our premium tier, we can also run what we call daily network scans. So that's 65,535 TCP ports and the top 4,000 UDP ports scanned every day, looking for changes in your attack surface. And then in a similar kind of dynamic to what I just described on the previous page, if we do find something and you've got your new service scan feature enabled, then we'll automatically look for the vulnerabilities in the case that we do find a change in your attack surface. So yeah, same principle, but you've got a point in time version, and here we're talking about an ongoing continuous process. Okay, so look, I could carry on down this sort of line of asset discovery for a while longer, but we are short of time, so I'm gonna cap it there. But just to sort of close off this section and in an attempt really to sort of articulate the types of outcomes we can drive with our asset discovery, I just want to share a quick customer anecdote with you. So a little bit of context on this one. We've got a customer you'd probably describe as a sort of medium-sized customer, over 1,000 employees, dozens of sites, I think generating probably over $500 million in revenues annually. So, you can probably see that the number of assets they're having to manage is not insignificant, shall we say. So that customer felt that they had a pretty clear view of their internet-facing attack surface until they actually used Intruder's asset discovery capability. And what they actually found was that the number of targets they had in scope of their program was short by about 50% versus reality. So In that example, the customer was really diligent. They took their new complete attack surface and brought that into the scope of their program. So they very quickly reduced that visibility gap. But the reason I'm sharing that example is because it's not really an atypical example. It's pretty normal for businesses to have pretty significant visibility gaps, and in this case, without even really knowing it. So for us at Intruder, that's a really, really good example of the types of outcomes that we can drive across the asset discovery aspect of the exposure management framework. Okay, so let's move on now and let's look at this concept of identifying weaknesses. So at the same time, I'm actually going to pivot and focus less on what happens when your attack surface changes and look instead at what happens when the threat landscape changes. So I'm just going to paint a picture for you here. I'm sure you'll be sort of familiar with it. Let's imagine it's sort of 5 p.m. on a Friday afternoon, or maybe in the run up to the holiday season. And that's when the dreaded announcement happens, just as you're about to close your laptop and go home. Some big new juicy vulnerabilities hit the headlines, and it's all over the news, and everybody's kind of reacting to it. Maybe you're getting questions from an exec team at this stage. Maybe they're asking if the business is vulnerable, have mitigating steps been taken, that sort of thing, or maybe some sort of third party is knocking at your door asking those same questions. So Intruder's got a couple of features that can deal with that, and I want to cover those here. So if we were to go into our scan tab and look at emerging threat scans, this emerging threat scan feature, every single time a vulnerability check is released, will automatically check every single asset inside Intruder. So we integrate with things like Slack and Teams. So as soon as that scan's complete, you'll get a notification confirming yes, you've been scanned, so you can answer those questions that are being chucked your way. And B, will confirm whether you're vulnerable. So, if you get an all clear, and you can see lots of examples on this right-hand side of scans that have been run automatically, and we've passed, so that's good. You get the all clear, good for you. You can, carry on out the office door and go and enjoy your weekend or holiday. But if, on the other hand, you do get, notifications that we found some assets that are vulnerable, at least then you've got the right information to make really, really informed decisions. And this is where you think about the tagging, the concept that Andy introduced, and I showed very, very briefly on the previous view. At that point, if you were to find a high critical app or asset that had a high critical vulnerability on it, then okay, fine, you might decide it's time to act there and then, or otherwise you can make a decision to risk accept or delay or whatever it might be. So it gives you that context to make really, really informed decisions. There is a second service that kind of goes hand in hand, or a second feature that goes hand in hand with emerging threat scans. We call it rapid response. I don't have enough time to go into it now, but we can basically just summarize by saying that our security team sits behind this feature and helps you to really, really quickly identify exposures before an attacker can. So taking that window of opportunity for an attacker, as Andy said, as close to zero as possible. So these types of features, can have a really, really transformational effect for some of our customers. I'm just actually going to read off a piece of paper one of our G2 reviews here, because I think it's a nice use case and a nice sort of it gives us a nice fuzzy feeling anyway. So one of our customers said of these particular features, it makes it feel like we have a virtual employee working for us, watching our back for new threats, scanning for us, and then reassuring us that we're okay. So for us, that's kind of the ultimate validation, and it's what we love to hear. Okay, so I'm really close to wrapping up now. I'm just going to show a couple more features, each of which start to overlap from this sort of weakness identification phase into follow-on phases. So, for example, prioritization, or the sort of act stage that Andy described as part of the framework. So just very quickly, as a design principle, we really believe that transition from finding assets and then finding issues through to prioritization and then through to patching, mitigating, or risk accepting. We believe that transition should be really easy to navigate. We don't want to drown users in data. We really want to provide actionable information so you can make decisions that will actually materially improve your business risk. So let me show you a couple of ways that we do that. If I go into our issues tab here, the first thing you'll notice, and I won't dwell on this one, we've got a noise tab. So any findings that are deemed to have sort of no impact on your business risk, this is where we put those findings. You can go and see them if you want to. They're there, they're available, but they're not going to be in your main view, distracting from some of the more kind of severe items that you need to give attention to. The second feature I wanted to sort of just draw attention to very quickly is there's a couple of examples here. These attack surface tags. So I think Andy explained really nicely the difference between a vulnerability and an exposure, but both can be used as part of an attack path by an attacker. So often these types of findings, because there's no CVE or CVSS associated with them, they're not technical vulnerabilities after all. They'll often get buried in amongst 50,000 other findings. But actually, some of these are really, really important, and they're really, really quick wins as well. So if we look at this example in front of us, an Apache Tomcat server exposed to the internet, in that particular example, the user would probably want to mitigate that risk and take it offline. It's an unnecessary exposure, and it can very, very quickly be remediated and addressed. So we just make that super, super clear with these attack surface tags for our users, so they can make, again, those decisions that can materially impact their business risk. And then the very final feature I'm going to show you is actually our attack surface view. So look, this is quite cool in itself, I think. At least it gives you a really nice view of how an attacker can see your organization from the internet, which is pretty cool. But actually what I want to draw attention to here is something really important, which is how it enables you to be really proactive when it comes to mitigation. So if we stick with that Apache example that I just gave you, let's suppose there is an emerging vulnerability for Apache. It's brand new, super fresh. There's no check available at this stage. And let's also assume even the details are pretty sketchy. So, it's all very, very fresh. There's not much you sort of know at this stage, but there's a vulnerability coming out. What you can do with attack surface view is start to look at all the different technologies that are running across your external attack surface. So you can click on Apache Tomcat in this case, and you can find an instance that's exposed to the internet. Let's suppose that you've tagged it somehow. We haven't here, but let's suppose you've tagged it and it's aligned to some sort of business critical asset, and it's a really important thing. At this stage, this view enables you to sort of move from a very kind of reactive, passive stance where you're waiting for a check or you're waiting for more information, and it allows you to become more proactive. You might decide, for example, that you want to put a firewall in front of it, or you might want to put some extra logging on it so that you can start to see if there's any sort of exploitation attempt. So again, just a really nice example of how those kind of core asset and weakness identification use cases actually are starting to transition into that act phase, so you can start to make really proactive decisions. Okay, so that is enough from me. I think I ran out of time. So just the final thing I wanted to say, you've obviously seen today some examples of how Intruder can support outcomes across those asset discovery and issue or weakness identification phases. We've kind of alluded to here and there some use cases that span into the other phases, but we haven't had time to go into any great detail. So if you do want to understand some more, if you want to learn how Intruder could maybe support your attack surface or exposure management strategy, please just get in touch. We'll happily sort of set up some time to give you a more comprehensive demo across all of the different use cases and all of the different exposure management stages. So that's all from me. Thank you very much for listening. And Nikki, I will pass back to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dane and Andy, for the overview on exposure management and then the walkthrough of the platform. We do have time for one question, and thank you for everyone who has popped them throughout our time together. I think a question for Andy, good one for you. We've had someone ask, are there any examples of exposure management being done well? So I think, Andy, are there any companies out there who are nailing it?
Yeah, good question. Thank you for asking. I don't know if there's anyone that's covering the full exposure management framework, the full process from start to finish as 100%. There are organizations that are focusing on different areas within the exposure management problem. You'll see many people doing attack path mapping specifically in cloud environments. The reason that is because APIs exist and cloud environments are queryable. When it comes to on-prem, those organizations that have traditional legacy on-prem environments, attack path mapping is still a very difficult thing to do. Bloodhound, I mentioned, is a tool that allows you to map Active Directory exploitation and attack paths, but not everybody runs Active Directory anymore. So trying to determine those attack paths is really difficult. So do I think anybody's nailing it? I don't know if anybody's nailing the full thing, but yeah, there are a bunch of organizations that are starting to help.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to close this off there. Thank you everyone for joining us. If we didn't get to your question, we'll come back to you directly throughout the week. And please remember to keep an eye out on your inbox. Tomorrow we'll be sharing the recording and a few other juicy resources that you can use. You can always get in touch with us via our chat box on the website or in the portal. And if you do want to speak to us in more detail around how we can help you protect your attack surface, please drop us a note and we can set up a meeting with one of our team. Thank you so much again, and we'll see you next time.